Cultural diplomacy is not really my strong suit. It's not something that I've done in the past. I mean, professionally at least. I've always worked with civil society, and I've always worked to promote women's rights. So but it's an issue, it's an area that's of interest to me because I'm Iranian and I'm also American. My mother's American and my father's Iranian, and my two countries have been at maybe not quite war, but pretty close to it for about 35 years, for about as long as I can remember. So cultural diplomacy is always, in my mind, has been a strategy for promoting peace and cultural understanding. And I know it's much broader than that, but those are the two elements that have been of most interest for me in terms of my personal life. I was born in Iran. We moved to the U.S. and then I went back in Iran I went back to Iran in 1999 during the time of reform. When I don't know how many of you know about Iran, but during the time of President Khatami. So it was a very exciting time, and there I began also to work on women's rights, which is what I was doing in the U.S. So it wasn't so far away. And it was a very exciting time. Since 2010, I've been back in the U.S., and I've been very lucky because I've been working with on women's rights, peace and security in the broader MENA and Asia region, and mostly in Islamic contexts. So I think I've been very lucky because I've been firsthand witness to a lot of developments, a lot of unprecedented historical developments in the region. And so what I'd like to talk to you about today is a little bit about the situation of women's rights and in this very volatile region. And then talk about what women are doing to sort of promote rights and why they should be engaged, as a group. There are civil society organizations, and they themselves should be engaged in cultural diplomacy efforts, and pose some questions to you that you can think about it. I assume that eventually in your lifetimes you're going to go on and you're going to be diplomats or you're going to work in this area. So it's good to think about some of these issues. That at least for me as a civil society activist, they're important. Now, I don't think I have to explain very much about what happened in sort of the region, what was dubbed as the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings. What happened is a lot of people were very surprised to see women in the public sphere in these countries. But for me, as a person who's lived in Iran for half her life, it wasn't so strange and it wasn't so unprecedented. It was really to be expected. So I think the Western population, they were very surprised to see that women were in the streets, they were fighting, for equality. Some of them were getting injured, they were getting killed, right? They were fighting for freedom and for self-determination of their nations. And in many of these countries, they, along with men, were fighting for change. And of course, we had revolutions that have now, many of them, except for probably Tunisia as a very rather positive development comparatively, have not turned out to be such good scenarios, showing that perhaps democracy is a long process and that we have to really work towards it. And this is certainly what women are doing. After engaging in the revolutions, many of the women remained in the public sphere and their roles in the public sphere and their presence in the public sphere began to change in a way. They started to demand more publicly inclusion in politics, inclusion in the process of writing constitutions, except, for example, in Egypt, they've had 2 constitutions since their revolution. Women really began from the very beginning to write constitutions, review constitutions. They weren't able to impact the first constitution under Muslim Brotherhood. The second one they actually did impact, and they got some good points in that constitution for women, even though the women's civil society groups had a lot of problems with other aspects of the constitution. But they managed to guarantee some rights for women. But this insistence on inclusion in the public sphere had a lot of backlash against women. First, it was by the repressive forces, the non-democratic forces. Second, it was by the political religious establishment, many of them who came to power after the revolutions. And third, it was by growing extremism, as we see, for example, cases of Syria now. Syria, I think, is one of the main cases, and also conflict, right? So we see a sort of a pushback of women demanding change from the dictators, from the establishment. Then you see sort of these political religious groups turning up, pushing back women again, trying to redefine their human rights, their presence in the public sphere. You see extremism which actually targets women very, very immediately and targets their bodies, their presence in the public sphere in a very overt manner. In fact, it's one of the most essential ideologies of some of these extremist groups that have emerged. And then obviously, because of conflict, I think that probably many of you are aware of what happens to women in conflict. So this is, it's a pushback against women. One of the main things that happened that I think was interesting for us to observe was this contestation of women's rights so publicly after the revolutions and the uprisings in the Arab world. And, it doesn't mean that before, many of these rights were contested because the men contesting them, many of the men contesting them were saying that these are Western rights, that they're rights of the dictators, that, without recognizing that actually many of these rights were rights that women had fought for, but perhaps some of those dictatorial regimes had actually used it as a showcase to show that they are actually supporting human rights for their Western counterparts. What was interesting for me to see was that many in the West started talking about women's rights in terms of, we don't want to impose our culture on them, right? So not recognizing the universality of women's rights, but saying that you have a different culture and we're not going to impose that on you. But really in the West, you find people imposing all sorts of things on Easterners. Their economic system, their political reform system, but when it comes to women, they have a different culture. And this is, it's been a very interesting thing to sort of observe. I mean, it's quite alarming actually, but it's been very interesting. And we see sort of this fight for rights being taken up at the international level as well, where you have some repressive governments, some religiously based governments, not just Islamic governments, but you also have, for example, the Holy See, right? The sort of a lot of the Christian sort of conservative groups fighting against women's rights guarantees at the international level. So it's interesting how this interplay has happened. And of course, because it's women, not a lot of people are alarmed by it as much as they would be alarmed by other contestations. So you've had a legal pushback on women's rights at the national and the international level. You've had violent conflict, and you've had a resistance to women's political participation. Another challenge that women face in this region is lack of access to media. So you have a lot of regressive ideas being promoted through media, especially satellite media that perhaps is being supported by Saudi Arabia, for example, that's sending out very regressive messages on women's rights, but women don't have the power or the capacity to contest this because they don't have the same access to media that some of these nations do, some of these groups do. So it's very difficult. But it doesn't mean that women have been quiet. Women haven't been quiet. They've been fighting. They've not only been resisting much of the backlash, but they've been framing the discourse and the issues. I think that we watched, for example, I'll bring another example of Egypt because I think the women's movement in Egypt is one of the most amazing movements that we've watched the level of violence in Tahrir Square. Women have organized to respond to this. Actually, they started organizing to respond to this many years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, and they started talking about sexual harassment. And when they started working on this, they didn't even have a term to describe sexual harassment. And now that term that women in Egypt actually started to coin to describe sexual harassment is being used all across the region. And so they've organized groups that go into the circle of hell where women are being attacked in public protests to save them. They've worked to pass legislation. They've worked to pass, raise public awareness. So they've done amazing work. They're not only responding to the pushback on their rights, but they're really framing the issues. And that's the point I want to drive home today, is that, oftentimes it's only the women. Women are at the forefront of fighting some of this growing extremism that is threatening not only for the region, but for the global community. And they should be supported. And I think that, going back to cultural diplomacy, if it does nothing else, I think it gives the group of people who are engaged in cultural diplomacy efforts, it gives them visibility, it gives them voice, it gives them access to media, for example. And so today I want to argue the importance of actually engaging civil society that's fighting for human rights and fighting for women's rights in cultural diplomacy efforts. But in order to make these efforts successful, I think that there are certain issues that need to be taken into consideration. And I'm going to put these out there for you to think about. We can discuss it if you'd like. But, okay, so, all right. So, cultural diplomacy. I mean, I understand that this is a softer side of politics, that it has to do, it is very much tied to national interests. But my question really is, what is national interest? And I think that, when we try to frame, in an increasingly global community, I think our national interests they begin to merge, right? So they become our human interests. And I want to say that cultural diplomacy is about values. It's important, while it's important to understand people that we don't understand, groups that we don't understand, but this understanding should be based on values. We don't want to give groups that are working against human rights, working against women's rights, working against peace, the visibility and the access and the power that engagement probably does give that. And so it's critical to give groups that are fighting, that are threatened, they're fighting for human rights, some sort of visibility and access, that also have common values of human rights, democracy, peace. And women's groups are one of those groups. Another issue that I think it's important to take into consideration is that, with respect to values, is that if we're promoting human rights and we're promoting women's rights, then it's important to recognize that in our efforts at cultural diplomacy as well. I'll give you an example. For example, I was just in a conference which was very interesting. We had some very courageous women from Afghanistan there who were talking about the peace processes in Afghanistan, and one of the recommendations that they had is that the international community should stop imposing its will on the Afghan women. That their insistence on making peace with the Taliban, and this was very interesting because this is not necessarily what you hear, has made it so that the international community starts talking about the good Talib and the bad Talib, without recognizing that whether it's a good Talib for the international community or a bad Talib for the international community, they're still targeting women's rights in the same way. So who's really going to stand up for women's rights? If one of the excuses of going to war in Afghanistan was to save the women, and this was, often, even if it wasn't said very clearly, it was definitely implied, then why is it so easy now to sort of sell out women's rights? And so I think that this is a question, this is something that needs to really be taken into consideration. They also were very critical of the fact that these processes and that engagement, the political engagement and the cultural engagement, has been very non-transparent, and then these groups are turning up everywhere, they're speaking up, and civil society and women's groups don't really have the capacity to fight it or to counter it just because of lack of information. And this is happening with the international community. So I think that they were also asking for opportunities to be visible. The second issue that I think, beyond values, that's really important is that our politics and public and cultural diplomacy cannot be at odds to the degree that they are. They often are. So we talk about public diplomacy, or we talk about cultural diplomacy, we're talking about promoting understanding. It's very nice, and it sounds very nice, right? But it often goes in odds with our politics, and politics, of course, are much more effective and much stronger. For example, I'll give you an example of today's headlines, or yesterday's headlines, actually. Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State, went to Egypt, and he vowed to give $500 million of the $1 billion, more than $1 billion in aid to Egypt, on the same day that Egypt sentenced a journalist to 7 years in prison, where thousands of people have been, sort of in summary, trials have been sentenced to death, where actually one of our colleagues 2 days ago was arrested for protesting. She's a human rights defender for protesting. So it sends the wrong message. So how are we going to engage? How are we going to talk about understanding culture, when policy is so far opposed to this? Or for example, Saudi Arabia, if we talk about growing extremism And this is one of the main challenges that we're facing in both the cultural diplomacy realm and the political realm. But you have the West really supporting Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is one of, not only is it a violator of human rights, violator of women's rights, but it is a financial supporter of many of these extremist groups. So this really, I think there are a lot of contradictions. And so, yeah, so it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge for all of you if you're going to work in this realm. I'm posing this as a challenge to you. We have in Afghanistan, I'll give you one more example of Afghanistan, which is something, when I came back from Iran, I would go to meetings on peace, and they would have it was sort of shocking to me because it was just so strange. And I think the peace community has gotten used to this here because it's Washington and the military is so ever present. And they would talk about these, the female engagement teams in the Marines. Has anybody heard about this? They have the women, so which is, this is problematic in and of itself. So women have fought to go in the military, which is wherever you stand on that. But then they give them the traditional female role in the military. So they reach out to the women in Afghanistan and they sort of support them on a social level, right? But in actuality, what they're doing is when they go to these women's homes and they sort of try to find out what they need and what their issues are, they're trying to figure out where the men are, their Talib husbands or brothers or fathers or, what's going on. And so, but they never think about what happens to those women when they leave, right? What happens to those women when you have engagement with a female Marine and then you have bombings, right? So it's very much in contradiction to our ideas of promoting cultural understanding and supporting women. So I think that this is another challenge in terms of how do you bring policy and politics closer to the notion of promoting cultural dialogue, cultural understanding, and peace through cultural exchanges. And then lastly, I want to say, and I'll finish with this, and then if you have questions or discussions, we can talk about it. But my last recommendation really is that I think when we talk about cultural diplomacy, oftentimes we think about exchanges. I mean, I see here that you're obviously, many of you are not from the US, but from the US side, when we talk about it, we talk about bringing people to the US so they can understand our system of life, they can understand our educational system, the way we do business, and to understand, but the reality is that many of the people who live in other countries, and especially developing countries, and if we look at the Middle East, they know a lot about life in the US. I'll give you an example. Iran is for years was the hated country by the US, but people in Iran really actually, it's probably one of the only places where the population actually likes the West and likes Iran. Of course, this began to change because of the sanctions. For so many years, there were sanctions and they started to really question that. But people know about the US. They know much more about the US than the US knows about Iran. And on 9/11, actually, there were protests, there were candlelight vigils in support of the victims of 9/11, which I think that this is very shocking to many Americans. So you have this understanding, but you don't have the same understanding for the developing world, for the Islamic world on the part of Americans or on the part of Westerners. And so I think the cultural diplomacy, there should be as much of an effort put on creating understanding among people in the Western world, especially since they are economic powers and military powers, and they make many decisions that impact the lives of people living in the global South. So that's sort of my last recommendation. I think if we can open it up to questions, if you have questions or suggestions.
First, let's express our gratitude.
Thank you. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm critical of a lot of these U.S. policies in this region, and I think that it poses a lot of problems. I think, on the other hand, there are people within the U.S. government who are advocating cultural diplomacy, but that, I'm pointing out the contradictions, and I think that they have to come closer together. Policy and, this attempt to promote understanding have to come closer together. Yeah, I think that the international conventions are important. I think many of the Islamic countries have sort of adopted these conventions with reservations. So the reservations create a lot of problems because, you know, that they tend to be very blanket reservations, so that they say that as long as they're not opposed to national law, or they're not opposed to the, you know, to Sharia law, so this, it's very, you know, so it's very vague. So it means that there's not much will, but I think that they're important in the sense that they give women a tool by which to advocate for this, for changes. So they are critical in this sense. But what we're seeing, and I mentioned this, that we're seeing a backlash at the international level, not just in this region or not just in the global south, but really seeing it at the international level. So if you look at the CSW, I don't know if you followed this at all, but there is a backlash. There's a backlash by Russia, by the, you know, the Catholic Church, by some of the, you know, Catholic countries, some of the Islamic countries, and countries that can't sit, some of these countries can't sit together. They don't agree on anything, but the one thing that they agree on is how to water down international laws, or, you know, push back on women's rights. So we do see this, and I think it's critical to maintain international standards on women's rights at the international level. That we shouldn't, you know, we're backsliding on the discourse, that we're not only pushing for more, we seem to be, we're just trying very hard to maintain what we have, and I don't think we're being very successful. And, you know, so this goes back to the issue of the cultural relativism that's often used. And this, I think, is a very problematic. It's not, human rights is not relative to culture. This is the experience of, you know, of humankind. It's our common experience. It's the common ground of our experience. So I don't think it should be negotiated. People at the national level, on the ground, they have to negotiate sometimes, but I think at the international level and at the UN system, it should be a non-negotiable. But unfortunately, that's not what's happening. Sure. I mean, I do really believe that change has to come from within any society. I think that, you know, the question is, who do you empower to create change or resist change from when you talk about politics, right? So when a country like Saudi Arabia or many of these other look, I mean, you talk about Egypt, for example, or many of these other countries, the U.S. and the international community was supporting dictators, people who were gross violators of human rights, and it had nothing to do with women, it had nothing to do with human rights. It was about strategic alliances that maybe had very little even to do with the West, right? So for the region. I'm not sure when there's that level of sort of commitment to a strategic alliance or to a political end, how much you as practitioners of cultural diplomacy can actually have impact. I mean, I don't know, you know, I think that I tend to be much closer to the cultural diplomacy end just because we don't have the same level of, right, power. So, but I think that what we can do is we can question and we can, you know, bring attention to some of these contradictions. I think that definitely change needs to come from within. It's important for us not to bend our standards, our international standards. And this is one thing that, you know, I learned when I was in Iran, for example, working on women's rights. Well, you know, perhaps I wouldn't have such an extreme sort of position, or even if I went back now on sort of insisting on human rights. There'd be places and times where I'd have to be more flexible, or, you know, taking into consideration the power system, the community, right? But I think at the international level, we can't do that because we cannot lower the bar for women, right? So, and we see that a lot at the international level. They say, oh, well, that's their culture, and, you know, or I spoke someplace and people were saying, well, how can we help women without imposing our values? So I think that this is really critical, that there are certain human rights and certain human values that really are universal. So not differentiating between that. There are women in Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia is, you know, we have a couple of stories like that, but Saudi Arabia is one of the greatest violators of women's rights, right? But it's a country that's where women are educated, they're trying to make change, right? But they're constantly sort of facing this wall. And so you have countries like the US or the Western countries that are very critical of their supposed enemies on rights, but never critical or publicly critical of their allies. And so I think, that's kind of what I'm saying, is to bring attention to that. And obviously, if the American Embassy, for example, has a program for women, if women are responsive to it, or if they're if the program is designed in consultation with women on the ground, then I think it's fine, and you can create that, you can facilitate space, you can facilitate, presence in public sphere, but I think it's critical.
And I think it's very important.
Yeah. And I mentioned this, I went through it, but I think also values, like I said, values are really important. Because with cultural diplomacy, you're giving access, you're giving to whoever you engage. You're giving them space, you're giving them visibility, you're giving them access to media, resources, right? So it's important to engage the people who are advocating for human rights, not against it. So, and we see this often, is that, I'll use the U.S. as an example because it's my other country, right? So I don't mean to just, I'm sure it happens many other places, that you don't, for civil society activists or women's rights activists, they don't, if they want to get a visa to come to the CSW, for example, the Commission on the Status of Women, which is a yearly event on status of women's rights at the UN, they don't get visas. But then you get 10 seminary students coming, that are sort of, they get the visas. I don't really understand, so they come for courses, or they come and spend 3 months in the U.S. And so, I think that we have to really be critical of how this is playing out and who we're engaging. Just because somebody is different doesn't mean that we should engage it. I think we should look at where changes are happening and support groups that are creating positive change. Sure, I think it's important, certainly in countries where perhaps government and politicians don't talk with civil society very easily, or where especially women's issues are not on the agenda. Yeah. I think it should be, research shows that actually that what creates change for women, what creates, sort of promotes equality and inclusion of women is not so much women's inclusion in the political, women's representation in politics, rather that it's strong women's movements. Yeah. So, and I think that they're very much interlinked. So I think it's important for the political apparatus or the political structures, whether they're opposition political parties or political groups in power, in parliament, that they engage with civil society and especially begin a conversation on women's issues, particularly in my region of the world, but then other places, because it's in fact women that is the one, 50% of the population that that they're discriminated against everywhere. So so we need to have this conversation not just in the Islamic countries, but really all over the world and even in the West. But I think it's a great idea, and proposing this to them as to sort of. Yes, and we have to get, I think again it's for values, is getting people in political office that support, human rights, support, plurality, democracy, that they are supportive of civil society, and that I think is the key. And so, so any kind of exchange or any kind of cooperation that promotes that, I think it's fabulous.
Not being critical.
Yeah. Well, the U.S. has it's a separation of church and state, but religion is very much present in the politics in the U.S., and I think much more than Europe, right? We see this, and you have a serious conservatism in the U.S. that at the same time, advocates small government, lack of social safety net, right? And then, So yes, so I'm actually, I think one thing that President Obama did, which was great, and it was, opposed, was the health care bill, which is yes, it's had its problems, but I think ultimately it's very good. So it's just America can be a nicer place for its citizens, hopefully, and so maybe maternity leave will also